Okay guys, so today we're going to start the muscle chapter. We'll do 3 lectures on the muscles, and this is a pretty intense lecture when it comes to physiology, talking about the way that the muscles work. So it's really important that you keep up with it. This lecture today is going to focus a lot on the anatomy of actual muscle tissue and muscle fibers. So we'll talk about all different structures that are present in the muscle fiber. It is incredibly important that you guys memorize these, because the rest of the lecture is going to be really difficult if you haven't memorized all of the structures first. So after today's lecture, go through, make flashcards for all of these bolded terms, and make sure you're super comfortable with them. Then when you watch tomorrow's lecture, and then the final day, that will make a lot more sense, and it'll be a lot easier for you guys to follow along with the way that the muscles work if you've really learned their structure or their anatomy well. Your objectives, guys, will help you to, or help guide you in your studying until I post the study guide. So first, right off the bat, when we talk about this chapter, when we talk about muscle tissue, what we're talking about is specifically skeletal muscle tissue. There are actually 3 types of muscle tissue. There's something called smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is present in a lot of different areas around the body. It's present in the lining of the GI tract. So, like when your GI tract, the tube, right? When the tube squeezes and squishes to push food through, that's smooth muscle that's doing it. Smooth muscle also lines our blood vessels. This is how our blood vessels can dilate or get bigger, or they can constrict and get smaller because the muscle that's lining them. Smooth muscle is also present lining our bronchioles, the little tubes that lead down into the airways. And when that muscle contracts or relaxes, it allows us to direct airflow to different parts of the lungs. Smooth muscle is also where the problem is in patients who have asthma. Asthmatic patients have, or when an asthma attack is happening, it's bronchoconstriction. So that smooth muscle contracts and it squeezes those tubes closed so that the air does not get into the lungs appropriately. So that's what happens in an asthma attack. So muscle, there's 3 different types. There's smooth muscle, there's cardiac muscle, and hopefully just from looking at the word cardiac, you can tell me where cardiac muscle is. Cardiac muscle is a very specialized type of muscle tissue that's present in the heart. Then there's skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle is the muscle that is typically attached to the skeletal system or attached to the bones. Not always. There are some muscles that actually insert or attach to like the skin or attach to other muscles. But for the most part, the skeletal muscles attach to the bones or the skeletal system. That's why we call them skeletal muscles. Most muscle in the body is skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscles allow us to move our body and also to maintain posture. When our skeletal muscles contract or shorten, they pull on the bones that are attached to them. And that's how we're able to purposely move our body around. Speaking of purposeful movement, when we talk about skeletal muscles compared to the other types of muscle, there are a few things that make skeletal muscle different. One, skeletal muscle is what we call striated. Striated means striped. When we look at the skeletal muscle cell under the microscope, it is striped. It's perfectly striped. You'll see really dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, all the way down the muscle fiber. And that just has to do with the way that the proteins are arranged. Skeletal muscle is packed full of proteins, and they're in a pattern. And there's really dense proteins and then lighter proteins, then dense, then lighter, all the way down the muscle fiber. So when you look at it under the microscope, the dense part doesn't allow any light through and it's dark. The part that's not very dense does allow the light to come through, so it's light. Not all muscle is striated. Skeletal muscle is striated and cardiac muscle is. Smooth muscle is not. That's literally why it's called smooth muscle, because it does not have those stripes in it. It has a smooth appearance instead. Skeletal muscle is the only muscle that's included in the muscular system. So when we say, the body systems, right? The skeletal system, urinary system, nervous system. When we say the muscular system, we do not include all muscle. The muscular system includes only skeletal muscles. Okay? Again, cardiac muscle is the heart, so that would be the cardiovascular system. Smooth muscles in a lot of different body systems. Another thing about skeletal muscle tissue that's important is that it's what we call voluntary muscle. Voluntary means that we consciously control it. You have the ability to purposely, consciously control your skeletal muscles. Our central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, has neurons that reach out to our muscles, and every single muscle has a junction with a neuron. Every muscle cell has a junction with a neuron, and our skeletal muscles only contract when we purposely tell them to do so. We do not voluntarily control the other types of muscle. A smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are what we call involuntary. You've never, I guarantee you, sat there and said, you know what, I'm going to push food through my GI tract right now. Never. You don't think about that, right? It happens all the time without you even thinking about it. Same thing with your heart, right? When you go to sleep and you're completely relaxed and you're not intentionally telling your heart to beat, it still beats. Okay, it is involuntary. It does it on its own. You don't have conscious control. You cannot willfully stop your heart. You can't decide, I don't want it to beat right now. But you can do that with your muscles, right? I can decide, hey, I'm going to lift my arm up. I'm going to put my arm down. I'm going to twirl my arm around, right? You have a voluntary, conscious control over your skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are also vascular. All muscle tissue is. But remember, vascular means that there are blood vessels present. There's actually a whole lot of blood vessels present in skeletal muscle tissue. So there are numerous different functions of skeletal muscle tissue. The most obvious of these that we're all aware of is to produce movement. Our skeletal muscles' major job, the major function is to contract, right, or to shorten. And think about like your bicep muscle, which is this muscle right here. When it contracts, it pulls on your arm like this, and that allows for movement. Hey, your tricep muscle back here, when that contracts, it pulls the arm out this way. That allows for movement. Our skeletal muscles can also contract just enough to hold us in a position or to help us maintain posture. So when I'm sitting here right now, even if I'm not moving my body at all, I have a lot of different muscles that are contracting to hold me up in this position. If they weren't, I would slouch over, right, or fall out of my chair. So our muscles don't have to move our body. Sometimes they contract just enough to kind of counteract gravity's pull on us and keep us in one spot. Skeletal muscles support a lot of other soft tissues. So for example, think about like your abdominal muscles. You have multiple layers of abdominal muscles that form this front abdominal wall. And right behind that, you've got a lot of soft tissues that don't have very much structure. So your intestines, for example, Your intestines are, like your small intestine is 21 feet or so of tube that's all really soft and curled around, and it bends back and forth, and it's all kind of squished into your abdomen. If you didn't have muscles there, those intestines would just like flop out. So the abdominal wall is important for holding those soft tissues in place and supporting those soft tissues. Skeletal muscle guards the entrances and exits to certain parts of the body. It does this by forming something called a sphincter. Now, we have a couple different types of sphincters. There are sphincters that are made out of skeletal muscle that we consciously control, and there are sphincters that are made out of smooth muscle that are automatic. We don't consciously control those ones. But an important part of skeletal muscle is to form these voluntary sphincters. So what a sphincter is a circular band of muscle that closes and opens a tube. So, for example, if we think about our GI tract. So if you think about your GI tract, it goes from your mouth down, to your stomach, your intestines, and your GI tract, which is a tube, right, goes all the way down until, all the way down until it gets to your rectum. Your rectum's like the last 5 inches of your GI tract. And at the very end of that, there's a sphincter, a circular band of muscle that circles around that rectum. When that muscle, so it's a circle, when the muscle is contracting, it squeezes it shut like this, so nothing can come out. When the sphincter relaxes, it opens up the tube and stuff can come out. The stuff I'm referring to is feces. Okay, so poop. Once it makes its way all the way down your GI tract, you have this sphincter that squeezes. It's called the external anal sphincter. That squeezes shut, and that's what keeps the poop from coming out of your body. Now, because this is skeletal muscle, because it's voluntary and we consciously control it, we can decide when to relax that sphincter and allow the feces to leave our body, right? Which is pretty nice. I'm glad that I can control when I go poop. The reason you can control it is because this sphincter is made out of skeletal muscle, voluntary muscle. We also have the external urethral sphincter that guards the urethra. The urethra is the tube that leads out of your bladder. So there's a small tube that leads out of the bladder. It's got this little circular sphincter, little circular band of muscle. When it contracts, you don't release pee. When it relaxes, you do release pee. So skeletal muscle allows for movement of the body, allows us to maintain posture and body position, supports other soft tissues, like in the abdomen, for example, guards some of the entrances and exits to the body by forming sphincters, little circular bands of muscle. Skeletal muscles also allow us to maintain body temperature. When the muscles contract, they generate heat. So the muscles generate heat. This heat gets distributed or spread throughout the body because of the blood, right? The blood picks up heat in one area, and then as it flows through the body, it kind of carries that heat everywhere. So we end up being one nice uniform temperature. But the heat in our body, this warm-bloodedness, is because our muscles generate heat for us when they contract. Also, think about what happens when you're really, really cold. You shiver. And shivering is just really rapid muscle contraction because I just said contractions make heat. So if you're contracting and contracting really, really fast, you're making a lot of heat. And that helps to warm the body up back to a normal temperature. Finally, we store some nutrient reserves in our muscle fibers. We store glucose, as glycogen. So if you think back to the chemistry chapter, I told you guys this chemistry stuff was important. It would come back. If you think back to the chemistry chapter, remember the organic compounds that we talked about. When we talked about carbohydrates, we talked about glucose. And glucose is a sugar that we use to fuel the body. Well, when we have plenty of glucose around, we store it. And the way that we store it, or kind of put it in the bank, is by converting it to a really large molecule called glycogen. So glycogen is a bunch of glucose together. So it's like glucose, 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 right? And we put a ton of glucose and we connect them all to each other. And then we store that glycogen in the muscle and in the liver. So inside our skeletal muscles, we store glucose as glycogen. And we also store amino acids as protein. Now, these proteins are functional. We need those proteins for our muscles to work. So we don't typically break those down. The glycogen will break down all the time. Whenever we need sugar, we'll come in and we'll break one of them off and we'll use it. And then we'll break another one off and we'll use it. That's great. But these proteins, we actually need those for the muscle to work. So we typically don't break those down into amino acids. The only time we would start breaking those down into amino acids is if we're literally starving. So if you've used all your glycogen and all your sugar, and then you've used all your fat that you have stored up, and you still don't have any nutrients, then you could start breaking down these proteins into individual amino acids. And then you could use those amino acids for fuel. But we typically don't start eating up our muscle tissue to fuel the body. It's the glycogen that we would normally use for fuel. But in the skeletal muscles, we store glucose and we store amino acids. Our muscles have multiple layers of connective tissue, kind of like membranes, right? Remember in the bone, we had the periosteum around the outside and then the endosteum on the inside. Well, we also have connective tissue membranes that are present in muscle tissue. In our skeletal muscles, we have 3 layers or 3 types of connective tissue. From the outside to the inside, they are the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium. Now, I'll tell you guys right off the bat, myo means muscle. So we'll see this myo a lot. Sorry, that looks like an A. Let's see. We'll see this root myo a lot. So looking at these layers, my, that tells us that it's in the muscle. Epi means upon. So the epimysium is the layer upon the muscle. This is the outermost or exterior layer that surrounds the entire muscle. So we're talking big, right? Like your whole deltoid muscle up here, this whole big shoulder muscle is surrounded by an epimysium. The epimysium is kind of a thick, tough, fibrous layer. It's the strongest layer, and it separates the muscle from the surrounding tissues. Now, off of the epimysium, there's another layer. It'll break off and it'll go into the muscle. And that's the perimysium. So the perimysium, like say this was my whole big muscle. And that whole big muscle is made up of numerous different muscle cells. So I have a bunch of different muscle cells in here, making up this big deltoid muscle. So this is my big muscle, and my muscle's made up of a bunch of different muscle cells. Around the outside of the whole big muscle, I have my epimysium. Then I have the perimysium. The perimysium, I said, goes into this muscle, and what it does is it surrounds bundles of muscle cells or bundles of muscle fibers. So it kind of groups the muscle up into groups of cells. So surrounds bundles of muscle fibers. A bundle of muscle fibers is called a fascicle. So I could say the perimysium surrounds muscle fascicles. Or I could say the perimysium surrounds bundles of muscle fibers or bundles of muscle cells. Then, and peri means around. So perimysium's like around the bundles of muscle fibers. Finally, we have the endosteum. Endo means within. So within, myo is muscle. So the endomysium is the layer within the muscle. It's the innermost layer, the smallest, delicate inner layer. And the endomysium surrounds each individual muscle cell. So it breaks off and it's going to come around every one of these muscle cells, or every one of these little muscle fibers is surrounded by an endomysium. You guys will notice I say muscle cell and then I say muscle fiber. It's the same thing. We'll look at, in a second, we'll look at the structure of a muscle cell, but they're really big. They're like really, really long stretches of proteins. So they're like protein fibers. So that's why we call them fibers sometimes, because they're not like traditional little round cells. They're very different. But whether I say muscle fiber or muscle cell, I want you guys to know that I'm talking about the same thing. Okay? So we've got the epimysium around the whole big muscle, and then the perimysium goes in and it surrounds little groups of muscle fibers, and then the endomysium goes in and it goes around each individual muscle fiber. Now, these layers of connective tissue, they have blood vessels and nerves that run along them. So it provides kind of like a roadway for the nerves and the blood vessels to get deep within the muscle to make sure that they get to every single muscle fiber. So the perimysium brings blood vessels and nerves to the bundles, and then the endomysium brings blood vessels and nerves to each individual muscle cell. And capillaries, remember, are just really tiny blood vessels. Also, when we look at the endomysium that surrounds every individual muscle cell, it contains special stem cells called myosatellite cells. Again, notice myo, right? Myo means muscle. These myosatellite cells are stem cells that help to repair damaged muscle. Remember that stem cells divide. They are cells that divide and divide and divide to make new cells. What happens is if you damage a part of your muscle, the stem cell will divide and the new cell that it makes will kind of fuse into that muscle fiber, repairing that damaged area. This happens to be how your muscles grow. When you work out, you damage them. That's why it hurts afterwards, because there's inflammation and swelling and pain that results because of that inflammation. But when you work out, you damage the muscle, and then these stem cells divide and they fuse into that damaged area. Well, every time that happens, you're adding more and more and more protein to the muscle, more fibers, more mass, so the muscle ends up growing. Okay, so Notice here we're taking a muscle, let me change colors. We're taking a muscle from the forearm, right? And we're blowing it up, we're looking at it bigger. Here you see, so this is like a big, large muscle. This is, you know, something that you could grab and feel and touch. It's not microscopic yet. You'll notice that this whole big muscle is surrounded by the epimysium. So this membrane that goes around the outside to separate the muscle tissue from everything else in the body is the epimysium. Then when you look at the actual muscle fiber, if you like cut it and look, or sorry, if you look at the actual muscle, if you cut it and look inside the muscle, you'll see the perimysium goes in and it surrounds bundles of muscle cells. Okay, so it kind of groups, the perimysium groups the muscle into muscle fascicles or bundles of muscle fibers. Then, if we look at one muscle fascicle or one bundle of muscle fibers, we'll see that there's an endomysium that surrounds each individual muscle cell. So we could take this one fascicle, right? This one group of muscle fibers and look at it bigger over here. So this picture is one fascicle or one bundle of muscle fibers. Hey, if we put a bunch of these fascicles together, we would get the whole muscle. So the fascicle, the bundle of muscle fibers, is surrounded by the perimysium. So this connective tissue that goes around the outside is the perimysium. And then again, the endomysium goes in and surrounds each individual cell. So each of these in the middle, like this is one muscle cell. This is one muscle cell. This is one muscle cell. So each of the muscle cells or muscle fibers is surrounded by the endomysium. Now, don't get confused. When you look at these muscle cells, you see all these little red dots. Those red dots are just showing you the ends of the proteins that are present. Okay, so each of these is just one cell. At the end of the muscle fiber, we see that the collagen, the strong protein, from all of those connective tissue layers. So the collagen fibers from the endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium all fuse together at the end of the muscle. And that's how we form the, like tendons, for example. That's how we form the connective tissue attachments to bones. So like if you picture the end of the muscle kind of tapering off, and the muscle cells disappear, and all you have left is the collagen, the connective tissue. And then that connective tissue ends up connecting to a bone. And that's how the muscle connects to a bone. That's how it's attached to the bone that it's going to pull on. Now, these connective tissue attachments can be classified into two different types, depending on whether the collagen is like a really tight bundle or whether it's a flat sheet. So this connective tissue attachment is called a tendon when it's in a really like tight bundle, and it's called an aponeurosis when it's in a flat sheet. So let me show you on this page back here. So on this slide, you see this at the end, the white structure, that's a tendon. So all of the connective tissue, the collagen, comes together and it forms this connection to the bone, this tendon. If instead of being like my pinky, instead of being this tight round bundle, it was a perfectly flat, broad sheet of collagen, that's what an aponeurosis looks like. Our muscles have muscle tissue, obviously, which is what we're going to focus on for the most part, the muscle cells or muscle fibers. But there's also, like we just said, connective tissue in those three membranes, and there are blood vessels and nerves present in the tissue as well. Our skeletal muscles have a very extensive vasculature. That's just a fancy way of saying there's a lot of blood vessels. There are a whole lot of blood vessels present in our skeletal muscles. And the reason for that is that they're really busy tissues. They're very active. And because they're so active, they need us to supply a lot of oxygen and a lot of nutrients like glucose. Remember, glucose and oxygen are both needed in order to make ATP, cellular fuel. Remember, we said we can make ATP aerobically with oxygen and anaerobically without oxygen. But which way is more efficient? Which way do we make more ATP or more fuel? Hopefully you said aerobically, right, with oxygen. So we need to give our muscles a lot of oxygen so that they can make a lot of ATP so that they can work. And the only way we can supply that oxygen is with blood. So there are a lot of blood vessels present. That blood also carries away the waste products. Remember, when we make ATP aerobically, we make carbon dioxide or CO2 as a waste product. We've got to carry that away. Sometimes, if we're really working our muscles hard, we might use up all that oxygen, and we might have to make ATP anaerobically. And if you think back to that, remember we said that when we make ATP, when we make fuel without oxygen, we produce a waste product called lactic acid. And lactic acid, also the waste, has to be carried away. So the blood is how we do that. So a lot of blood vessels are present in muscle because it's really, really active. The blood vessels the blood brings the good stuff in, right, and takes the bad stuff or the wastes out. Nerves are also present. There are quite a few or a lot of nerves present in our muscle, skeletal muscle, because I told you guys that skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle, meaning that the muscle is controlled by nerves from the central nervous system, and the muscle only contracts when the nerve tells it to. So every single muscle fiber is connected to a nerve. We're going to take a second to look at the way that muscle cells develop, the way that they're made in the fetus, because that will kind of give us clues to the way that they're structured and the way, or the reason that they're structured the way that they are, the reason they have their own anatomy. So in a fetus, so when the baby is developing inside the womb, muscle fibers or muscle cells first form through the fusion of tons and tons of cells called myoblasts. I just told you guys myo means muscle. And think back to the skeletal chapter, the skeletal system that we just did. What did I tell you guys that blast means? I told you guys a blast is a baby cell, right? Osteoblasts were the immature bone cells. Well, myoblasts are the immature muscle cells. These are baby muscle cells, if you will. So a bunch of myoblasts, like we're talking hundreds, a lot of them, all fuse together. They all like melt into each other to make one single muscle cell, one mature muscle cell or muscle fiber. A mature muscle cell or muscle fiber will give us a myocyte. So when all these myoblasts form together, they end up forming a myocyte. A mature muscle cell or muscle fiber. Because this muscle fiber is made from hundreds of cells, it ends up being very big, very, very large. The myoblasts are like normal size cells, right? One microscopic cell. But because we have so many of these all fusing together, the muscle fiber gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And one single muscle cell, one muscle fiber, can be up to like I don't know the exact figure, but I think it's like 10 inches long. That's insane. That's really, really big. Again, most cells are microscopic. They're tiny. You can't see them without a microscope. So the fact that we could have one single cell that's that big is pretty incredible. So, muscle cells or muscle fibers are really big. That's why we call them fibers. They're also multinucleate. Most cells have one nucleus, right? And remember, inside that nucleus is DNA. That's the recipe book, the directions for how to make proteins. So most cells have one nucleus, one copy of DNA. Because the muscle cell or muscle fiber is made from hundreds of other cells, it has hundreds of nuclei. Each of these myoblasts that comes to fuse has a nucleus. So when the cell fuses, the nucleus is also fuses. The nucleus is also present. So if you think about this, this isn't an accident, right? Nothing in the body is an accident. Everything has a purpose. The reason that this is beneficial to have multiple nuclei is, again, each nucleus has a copy of DNA. So many nuclei means many copies of DNA. Which means you have a bunch of recipes for how to make proteins. So this allows for the muscle fiber to have an increased production of enzymes and other proteins. Remember, enzymes are proteins. But it allows them to have an increased production of enzymes and proteins. So they have more enzymes than most cells, meaning they can do chemical reactions faster, right? Like they can make ATP faster, they can do all sorts of chemical reactions faster because they have a ton of enzymes. And then more proteins, well, the muscle fiber is made up mostly of protein. So because it can make proteins more and faster, it can grow faster. Now let's kind of talk about this a little bit more and why this works. So we said many nuclei, it's multinucleate, so it's got many copies of DNA, so it can make enzymes and proteins more. If you think about your DNA as being a cookbook, right? It's got a bunch of recipes. And say I have one cookbook and I want to make sugar cookies. Well, I can copy that one recipe of sugar cookies and I can give it to one chef and he can make a batch of sugar cookies for me. Well, say I have 100 cookbooks. That means I have 100 copies of that recipe. So I can give it to 100 chefs at the same time. And I can get 100 batches of cookies. Okay, so that's kind of the premise there. If I have, a ton of nuclei, which is plural for nucleus, then I have a ton of copies of DNA. I can be copying all of those at the same time. So I can be, doing transcription of the DNA in every one of those nuclei at the same time. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, shoot me an email and we'll talk more. Skeletal muscle cells or muscle fibers also have myosatellite cells present. We mentioned these when we talked about the endomysium, right? Remember, these myosatellite cells are stem cells that are present in the endomysium, which surrounds each individual muscle fiber. These myosatellite cells are just myoblasts that don't actually fuse with the muscle fiber. So when all the other myoblasts, all the other baby cells are coming and fusing together, some myoblasts just stay right on the outside of the muscle fiber. They don't actually fuse. They just sit right on the outside. Now, they're stem cells. They retain the ability to divide. So if the muscle is damaged in some way, then that cell, the myosatellite cell, will again divide and fuse in and fix the damaged area. So here we see a few things. One, if you look up here at the top, that is an actual muscle fiber. Okay, so that's real. You can see that everything we're saying is reality. We're not making any of it up. So if you look at it, you'll see one, that it's striated. Right? And what does striated mean? Striped. Right? Very, very clearly striped. Dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light. And again, that's because the proteins that make up the muscle fiber are very, very organized, and it's a repeating pattern that goes all the way down. You'll also notice that there are a bunch of nuclei, right? That's a nucleus. Each of these dark spots is showing you a nucleus that's present. So there are a lot of nuclei. Oops, I circled something that was not a nucleus. Sorry. These here, I can't exactly tell, but those might be myosatellite cells. I would have to get in closer to see if that was a nucleus or a myosatellite cell, but I think these on the edge are myosatellite cells. Now, here what we see is the actual formation of a skeletal muscle fiber. And again, this happens in the fetus. So when the fetus is developing in the womb and all of the, little organs are being made, the muscles are also being made, and it starts with myoblasts. So up here you see these myoblasts, these immature little muscle cells, and they're all separate cells. To form the actual muscle fiber, they fuse together. So you see that they start to like melt into each other, and the fiber gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And every time another myoblast fuses, it gets larger and another nucleus gets added. What we end up with is a really, really big cell, right? A really large muscle fiber, a really large, long cell. So you'll see this long kind of cylinder-shaped muscle fiber. You see the striations. You see a bunch of nuclei present. The endomysium is this connective tissue layer that surrounds the outside of it. And you'll notice what's present in there are myosatellite cells. If you look at the whole development here from the beginning to the end, the myosatellite cell is this one that's like a different color. You'll notice that when all of the other cells are fusing together, that one doesn't. That one just stays on the surface. And that ends up being one of the stem cells that will help repair muscle. So say I work out really hard and I damage this area of my muscle right here. I tear some of the proteins. This myosatellite cell will divide, and one will stay there so that we still have that myosatellite cell. But the extra cell that we made will just fuse into the muscle fiber, and it'll just add those proteins there to fix the area that was damaged. I'm trying to see, if you look here at this one where it's blown up a little bit bigger, you'll see, like if you look here inside, it's made up of a bunch of long, like what are called myofibrils. They're long strands of protein. So each of these dots, each of these red dots over here is showing you the end of like a long strand of protein. So this is just made up of tons and tons and tons of myofibrils. All right, so now we're going to start talking about all of the different structures that are present, all of the different like organelles that are present in a muscle fiber. This is the part that you've got to memorize. Okay, so I want you to make sure that you memorize each of these bolded terms before you get to tomorrow's lecture. Super important. If you do that, it's going to be really cool to see it all come together. If you don't, you're going to be lost. Okay, so do it. All right, so the sarcolemma is just the cell membrane of a muscle fiber. So any other cell, we would say plasma membrane or cell membrane. But in a muscle fiber, just to be specific, we call it the sarcolemma. The cytoplasm, the stuff on the inside of the muscle fiber, is called the sarcoplasm. So we have a sarcolemma around the outside, and then everything inside, all of this stuff inside the muscle fiber, is the sarcoplasm. Now, this sarcolemma is really important in the muscle fiber because it separates the charges inside and outside of the cell, right? It allows us to control ions moving into the cell and out of the cell. And there's a difference in charges. Remember, there's more potassium inside the cell. There's more sodium, chloride, and calcium outside the cell. Also, remember that when you add all the charges together, right? Everything all added up inside the cell is more negative. The reason for that is that there's a bunch of proteins that are negatively charged. But inside the cell is more negative. Now, this separation of charges creates something called a transmembrane potential. Okay, transmembrane because it's a difference across the membrane. Potential because it's got the potential to make something happen. A change in this, right, a change in transmembrane potential is what triggers or initiates muscle contraction. So we'll see that if we mess this up, right, if we mess up that situation in some way, muscle contraction occurs. Okay, so sarcolemma is the cell membrane, sarcoplasm is everything inside. You do need to know these ions, so you need to know which one is where. Okay. Transverse tubules, or T-tubules, are narrow tubes that start at the sarcolemma and then they extend throughout the entire muscle fiber. So they're like these little tubes. They start at the sarcolemma, at the cell membrane, and they just go all through the muscle fiber. They're like a little tunnel system that goes through the muscle fiber. And what these transverse tubules do, or T-tubules do, is they transmit the electrical stimulus throughout the whole muscle fiber really, really quickly. And you can think of it kind of like wires, like the electrical wires in your house. They transmit the electricity through your house, right? Your electricity comes in at just one point at your house, but then you've got wires everywhere that bring the electricity all throughout the whole entire house. What the T-tubules do is they allow the entire muscle fiber to contract simultaneously at the same time. Remember, we said a muscle fiber is really big. So if I have this really long cell, I want the whole thing to get stimulated at the same time. The reason that happens is because of the T-tubules. Really quick, you guys, drawing is incredibly important in this section. I would practice drawing everything. It can be a crappy drawing, but practice drawing everything out, and you'll notice I am, right? Like I drew the epimysium, paramysium, and endomysium. I just drew the sarcolemma and the T-tubules. So really practice drawing everything. Everything I draw, you should draw and label it. And I think that will help you keep everything straight in your head, and it'll help you memorize everything better. All right, so I told you guys that muscle cells or muscle fibers are really made up of a bunch of proteins, and that these proteins are organized in a specific pattern all the way down the length of the muscle fiber. Well, these long strands of protein are called myofibrils. Myofibrils. So myofibrils are the long, thin subdivisions within a muscle fiber. Okay? Again, the myofibrils are just made out of tons of protein filaments. We call these myofilaments. So again, if this was my one muscle cell, right? This is my big muscle cell or muscle fiber. This muscle fiber is made up of a bunch of strands of protein. So there's one, right? The whole thing is jam-packed with a bunch of strands of protein. Those strands of protein are the myofibrils. Now, the myofibrils, we said, are made out of protein filaments, bundles of protein. And we can classify those bundles of protein as thin filaments or thick filaments. And again, remember I said they're going to repeat all the way down the length of the muscle fiber. Thin filaments are made mostly of a protein called actin. Mostly actin. There are a couple other kinds of protein that are present in the thin filaments. There's also something called troponin. And then there's something called tropomyosin. But the majority of the thin filament is made out of actin. The thick filament is made mostly out of a protein myosin. So if we look at this whole structure up here, right? This whole thing is my muscle cell or my muscle fiber. And I said that muscle cell is made up of a bunch of these long, thin threads of protein, the myofibrils. Myofibrils contain a repeating pattern of thin filaments and thick filaments. So we'll see that there's like, thin filaments sticking out, and then thick filaments, then thin filaments, thick filaments, thin filaments, thick filaments, right? All the way down the length of each of these myofibrils. It's these actual myofilaments, right? The actual thick filaments and thin filaments that are responsible for muscle contraction. The myofilaments are connected to the sarcolemma. They're connected to the cell membrane at each end of the muscle fiber. And what happens is when these filaments, when the thick filaments and thin filaments interact with each other, the myofibrils contract or shorten. And because they're connected to the sarcolemma on either side, you can imagine if everything here in the middle shortens, right? Everything pulls in towards itself. So everything is shortening like this. You can imagine that the whole muscle fiber would shorten. If this last part sounds like gibberish right now, don't worry about it. Just kind of giving you like a sneak peek. We'll talk about the actual process a million times by the end of this, and it will all make sense. Right now, again, I just want you guys to kind of memorize the bolded stuff. Okay, so myofibrils are the strands of protein that make up the muscle fiber. These myofibrils, the proteins, are organized into thick filaments and thin filaments. Thin filaments are made of actin. Thick filaments are made of myosin. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, this is actually a really specialized form of the smooth ER, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Remember we said that in muscle, it stores really large amounts of calcium, right? So we refer to it as the sarcoplasmic reticulum in muscle fiber. So we have the sarcolemma, that's the cell membrane. The sarcoplasm is all the stuff inside. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is a special smooth ER, or smooth endoplasmic reticulum. It stores huge amounts of calcium. The concentration of calcium inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum is more than 40,000 times as concentrated as like normal inside the cell. 40,000 times as concentrated. So there's a ton of calcium stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is like their little chambers that surround each of the myofibrils. So each of the strands of protein. Filaments. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum kind of wraps around these myofibrils. It wraps around these proteins. And it forms little chambers that are called terminal cisterna. And these terminal cisterna are going to attach to the T-tubule. So what happens is, say this is my muscle fiber. And I said that the muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils. So say that's one single strand of protein right there. The single strand of protein has the sarcoplasmic reticulum wrapped around it. And that stores a ton of calcium. So I've got a bunch of calcium stored inside this sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, I just told you, attaches to the T-tubules. If you guys think back to what I told you the T-tubules do, remember I said they span all throughout the muscle fiber, and they carry the stimulus. They carry that electrical stimulus throughout the muscle fiber really fast. So in general, what happens during muscle contraction is we'll stimulate the muscle, we'll tell the muscle to contract at the sarcolemma. Hey, that generates an electrical signal, an electrical stimulus. That electricity travels along the T-tubules and it gets to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. When it gets to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it tells it to dump its calcium. So all the calcium gets dumped out and it floods this myofibril. So there ends up being calcium all over this myofibril. And that calcium allows muscle contraction to occur. Okay? So for now, the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores a bunch of calcium. And when the electrical stimulus comes down the T-tubules and gets to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it dumps its calcium into the sarcoplasm, so the calcium floods all around the myofibrils. Okay, so here we can kind of see everything a little bit better than my drawings. This up here is just showing us the muscle fiber. Hey, remember the sarcolemma is the cell membrane. So the membrane all around the outside, just like any other cell membrane, it's a phospholipid bilayer, surrounds the whole outside of the muscle fiber. The sarcoplasm just refers to all the stuff inside. Remember that the muscle fiber contains a bunch of myofibrils, right? So each of these red dots that you see in here is showing you the end of a myofibril. So the myofibril, again, is just this long strand of proteins, of thin filaments and thick filaments. If we look down here at the picture at the bottom, it kind of blows everything up bigger so we can see more details. You still see the sarcolemma as the plasma membrane. You'll notice that the T-tubules are shown in yellow. You'll notice how they connect to the sarcolemma, and then they go in and travel all throughout the muscle fiber, everywhere. So no matter where we stimulate this muscle fiber first, the electricity is going to shoot through these T-tubules so that it goes everywhere. The myofibrils, again, are these strands of protein filaments. You'll notice they're made of thin filaments and thick filaments. Don't worry about the organization of them, but just the red lines are showing you thin filaments, the blue lines are showing you thick filaments. And they're organized in a special pattern, but they go all the way down each of these myofibrils. You'll notice that these protein filaments, the myofibril, is surrounded by a sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is the structure that's shown in blue. So it wraps around the myofibril. And remember, we said that the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores large amounts of calcium. So there's a ton of calcium here in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. All right, that is where we are at right now. Study hard. get really comfortable with everything so far. And then next lecture, we'll continue on with this, and we'll start to get, we'll learn more details about the myofibril, so you guys can actually draw, or you know what the proteins look like in the thin filaments and the thick filaments. And then we'll start to talk about how the muscle actually contracts. And then finally, we'll also talk about the way that a neuron stimulates the muscle fiber at a place called the neuromuscular junction. And then we'll talk about types of contraction as well. Okay? So if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me an email, guys.